Men, women who cheat don't just create alibis and cover stories. They deploy sophisticated psychological tactics designed to manipulate your perception, control your reactions, and make you doubt your own instincts when you sense something is wrong. Before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from. Psychological tactic. 1. Preemptive accusations. She accuses you of being controlling or insecure before you express concerns. When she begins making statements about not wanting to be controlled, about needing independence, about past relationships where partners were too jealous, or about valuing trust and hating, when partners question her, she's establishing framework where expressing any concerns about her behavior will be labeled as your character flaw, rather than reasonable response to suspicious activity. This preemptive framing makes questioning her seem like your problem with control or insecurity, rather than legitimate concern about her behavior. What this tactic accomplishes? This tactic accomplishes making you hesitant to voice suspicions, because doing so will result in being labeled controlling or insecure. By establishing these labels before you've expressed concerns, she creates psychological barrier where questioning her means accepting negative identity. Most men would rather ignore suspicions than be characterized as jealous, controlling partner. She's using fear of these labels to silence your instincts before they can surface as voiced concerns. Notice if these accusations appear before you've actually been controlling. If she's talking about not wanting jealous partner when you haven't exhibited jealousy, if she's emphasizing independence before you've restricted her freedom, if she's defending against control you haven't attempted, the preemptive accusations are preparing ground to dismiss future concerns. Defending against accusations not yet made reveals she's planning to do things that would naturally create those concerns. Watch whether controlling accusations escalate with your reasonable questions. If asking where she's going results in accusations of being controlling, if simple questions about her day trigger lectures about trust and independence, if normal couple communication is reframed as surveillance, she's using extreme characterizations to shut down normal relationship inquiry. Disproportionate responses to reasonable questions reveal manipulation rather than genuine boundary setting. Pay attention to whether she references other relationships where partners were too jealous. If she tells stories about exes who didn't trust her, past partners who were controlling, or previous relationships that failed because of jealousy, she's establishing pattern where men who questioned her were always wrong. This history creates framework where you questioning her means joining category of deficient jealous exes rather than having legitimate concerns. Observe whether accusations create guilt that silences you. If you feel guilty for having suspicions, if you silence concerns because you don't want to be controlling partner, if you've internalized idea that questioning her means you have trust issues, her tactic is working. When you're more worried about appearing insecure than about actual suspicious behavior, psychological manipulation has successfully redirected your focus from her actions to your supposed character flaws. Notice if she compares you unfavorably to men who trust their partners. If she references friends whose partners give them freedom, if she suggests healthy relationships don't involve questioning, if she holds up other men as examples of proper trust while implying you're deficient, comparison tactic adds social pressure to accusations. You're not just being told you're controlling, you're being told you're worse than other men who trust their partners. Why this tactic works? This tactic works because men want to be good partners who trust their women. Being labeled controlling or insecure attacks male identity and relationship self-image. By preemptively establishing that questioning equals character flaw, she creates psychological environment where you silence your own valid concerns to avoid negative labels. You'd rather doubt yourself than be seen as jealous, insecure man, which is exactly what allows affair to continue unquestioned. Psychological tactic 2. Gaslighting your observations. She makes you doubt what you clearly saw or heard. When you notice something suspicious, and she tells you it didn't happen that way, that you're misremembering, that you're seeing things that aren't there, or that you're being paranoid and imagining problems, she's using gaslighting to make you doubt your own perceptions and observations. This psychological manipulation makes you question your judgment, your memory, and your interpretation of events until you're uncertain whether you can trust your own eyes and ears. What this tactic accomplishes? This tactic accomplishes destroying your confidence in your own perceptions, so you stop trusting what you observe. When you doubt your ability to accurately perceive reality, you stop investigating suspicious activity because you assume your concerns are products of imagination rather than responses to real red flags. Gaslighting makes you your own worst enemy by turning your judgment against itself until you believe her version of reality over your direct observations. Notice if she denies things you clearly saw. If you saw text message flash on her screen and she claims message didn't say what you saw. If you heard her say something and she insists she said something different. If you observe behavior and she tells you it didn't happen, direct contradiction of your observations is gaslighting. Your perceptions are being invalidated to protect behavior you correctly identified as suspicious. Watch whether she attributes your correct observations to your imagination. If you notice she's acting differently and she tells you you're imagining things, if you point out factual changes in her behavior and she claims you're inventing problems, if observable reality is dismissed as your paranoia, she's convincing you to distrust accurate perceptions. When facts become imagination in her retelling, you're being gaslit. Pay attention to whether she questions your mental state. If responses to your concerns include suggestions that you're stressed, anxious, depressed, or not thinking clearly, she's pathologizing your accurate observations by attributing them to mental health issues. If she suggests you need therapy for having concerns about behavior that actually is concerning, she's trying to make you question whether you're mentally stable enough to trust your own judgment. Observe whether your certainty wavers after conversations with her. If you're certain about something you observed, but after talking to her, you're confused and uncertain, if solid observations become doubtful in your mind after she reframes them, if you walk away from conversations less sure of reality than when you entered them, gaslighting is successfully eroding your confidence. When conversations with her make reality less clear rather than more clear, manipulation is occurring. Notice if she becomes angry when you trust your observations. If you insist you saw what you saw and she responds with anger. If maintaining confidence in your perceptions triggers her rage. If she punishes you for refusing to doubt yourself. Anger is being weaponized to make doubting yourself less painful than maintaining confidence. When trusting yourself creates conflict, while doubting yourself creates peace, you're being conditioned to abandon accurate judgment. Why this tactic works? This tactic works because humans are susceptible to doubting themselves when someone confidently contradicts their perceptions. Repeated gaslighting creates genuine uncertainty about your ability to accurately perceive reality. When you no longer trust your own observations, you can't act on red flags because you've been convinced red flags are products of your imagination. Gaslighting neutralizes your detection abilities by making you question the validity of what you detect. Psychological tactic 3. Strategic vulnerability. She shares emotional problems to create sympathy that prevents questioning. When she begins sharing emotional difficulties, personal struggles, mental health challenges, or life stresses that create sympathy and protective feelings in you, she's establishing psychological dynamic where questioning her feels cruel because she's already dealing with so much. This strategic vulnerability makes you prioritize supporting her through difficult time over investigating suspicious behavior because adding to her stress seems heartless when she's clearly struggling. What this tactic accomplishes creating sympathy shield that protects her from questioning. When someone is vulnerable and struggling, natural human response is supporting, not investigating. By positioning herself as person dealing with difficulties, she makes questioning her feel like attacking someone who's already down. Most decent men won't press suspicions when partner seems fragile because doing so feels like adding burden to someone who's suffering. Notice if vulnerability appears alongside suspicious behavior. If she starts having emotional difficulties right when suspicious behaviors begin, if struggles emerge exactly when you'd naturally start questioning her activities, timing suggests vulnerability is strategic rather than coincidental. When emotional crises conveniently prevent investigation of concerning behaviors, protection might be more motivating than actual distress. Watch whether vulnerability is presented to specific people. If she shares emotional struggles with you and mutual friends, but seems fine in other contexts. If vulnerability is performed for people who might question her, but doesn't appear consistently across situations, selective vulnerability reveals strategic deployment. Real emotional difficulties don't turn on and off based on audience. Strategic vulnerability does. Pay attention to what topics become off-limits during vulnerable periods. If she's dealing with stress and suddenly questioning her, whereabouts becomes adding to her stress. If investigating concerns becomes attack on vulnerable person. If her emotional state makes normal relationship discussions impossible, vulnerability is being weaponized to prevent accountability. When emotional struggles make her behavior unquestionable, vulnerability serves protective function. Observe whether vulnerability increases when you express concerns. If every time you try to discuss suspicious behavior, she becomes overwhelmed with emotion, if attempts to address relationship issues trigger her emotional crises. If your concerns consistently get shelved because she can't handle them right now, emotional fragility is preventing important conversations. When timing of emotional inability to discuss issues aligns with when issues need discussing, timing reveals strategy. Notice whether she recovers quickly from vulnerability when useful. If she's too fragile to discuss your concerns but perfectly capable of maintaining social schedule. If she's too overwhelmed for difficult conversations with you, but not too stressed to text someone constantly. If vulnerability is selective about what activities it prevents. Inconsistent fragility reveals its tool rather than genuine state. Real distress affects all areas. Strategic distress is targeted. Why? This tactic works. This tactic works because good partners support struggling partners rather than interrogating them. Strategic vulnerability exploits male protective instincts and desire to be supportive partner. You feel like terrible person investigating someone who's already dealing with emotional difficulties. Your empathy becomes weapon she uses to prevent questioning while she maintains affair during period when she's supposedly too fragile to handle relationship discussions, but somehow capable of managing secret relationship. Psychological tactic. 4. Projection. She accuses you of what she's actually doing. When she suddenly becomes concerned about your faithfulness, questions where you are, asks about your phone activity, or expresses worry that you might be interested in other women despite never having reason to doubt you, she's projecting her own cheating onto you. This psychological projection serves dual purpose. It deflects attention from her behavior by making you defensive about yours, and it provides justification for her actions by creating narrative where you were unfaithful first or where mutual suspicion justifies her betrayal. What this tactic accomplishes? This tactic accomplishes shifting focus from her suspicious behavior to defending yourself against baseless accusations. While you're proving you're not cheating, you're not investigating whether she is. Projection also creates false equivalence, where if she eventually admits affair, She can claim she suspected you too, or that relationship problems were mutual, rather than acknowledging she was sole betrayer. By accusing you of what she's doing, she creates confusion about who actually violated trust. Notice if accusations appear suddenly without basis. If you've been faithful, and suddenly you're being questioned about your activities, if suspicion of you appears without any behavioral changes on your part that would warrant it, if she's concerned about your faithfulness when you've given no reason for concern, accusations are projection of her guilt rather than response to your behavior. Watch whether her accusations mirror her actual suspicious behaviors. If she accuses you of being secretive with your phone when she's protective of hers, if she questions where you are when she's been vague about her whereabouts, if accusations specifically match behaviors she's actually exhibiting, projection is revealing what she's doing by accusing you of it. Cheaters often project their exact behaviors onto partners. Pay attention to timing of accusations relative to her affair activities. If she becomes suspicious of you right after spending time with a affair partner, if accusations intensify when her affair activity increases, if guilt from her actions triggers suspicion of you, timing connects her accusations to her behavior. Guilt-driven projection often spikes after affair encounters, a psychological attempt to equalize wrongdoing. Observe whether accusations serve to justify her boundary violations. If her suspicion of you becomes reason she needs to check your phone, if accusations about you create justification for interrogating your activities while she maintains secrecy about hers, projection creates one-sided transparency. You're investigated while she remains protected. Double standard reveals projection is strategic rather than genuine concern. Notice if accusations create fights that justify distance. If accusing you of interest in other women creates conflict that leads to separation, if fights about your supposed untrustworthiness create emotional distance, if accusations produce relationship crisis that justifies time apart, conflict might be manufactured to create space for affair. Fighting created by projection provides excuse for distance that facilitates infidelity. Why? This tactic works. This tactic works because being accused of cheating when innocent makes you defensive and focused on proving faithfulness rather than investigating partner. While you're defending yourself against false accusations, you're not questioning her. Projection also works because it creates moral confusion, where your suspicions of her become equivalent to her suspicions of you, even though hers are baseless and yours are warranted. False equivalence allows her to frame mutual suspicion rather than acknowledging she's the only one actually cheating. Psychological tactic 5. Overwhelming you with details. She provides too much information to seem transparent while lying. When she responds to simple questions with elaborate detailed stories full of unnecessary specifics, when explanations for basic activities involve extensive descriptions, when she volunteers far more information than you asked for, she's using information overload to create appearance of transparency while actually lying. People telling truth give appropriate amounts of detail. People lying often over-explain because they believe more detail makes lies more believable, and excessive detail also overwhelms your ability to verify or remember specifics that might later contradict. What this tactic accomplishes appearing transparent through volume of information, while actual truth remains hidden. Excessive detail creates impression she's being open because she's sharing so much, but volume doesn't equal honesty. Details can be fabricated. By overwhelming you with information, she makes verification difficult because you can't remember or check all the specific details she's provided. Information overload masquerades as transparency while serving concealment. Notice if detail level seems excessive for the question. If you ask where she was and get 15-minute explanation about parking, what restaurant looked like, who walked by, what was on menu, entire play-by-play of evening, detail volume exceeds what simple question required. Appropriate responses match question scope. Excessive responses suggest constructed narrative rather than simple recollection. Watch whether details change in retelling. If you heard elaborate story once and ask about it later, and details are different, if specific elements she emphasized initially don't appear in later versions, if story maintains general structure but specific shift, contradictions in excessive detail reveal fabrication. Real experiences stay consistent. Over-explained lies drift because they're constructed rather than remembered. Pay attention to whether details can be verified. If story includes many details but none that could be checked, if all specifics are unprovable observations only she experienced, if verifiable elements are absent while unverifiable ones abound, detail selection reveals strategic information provision. Liars provide elaborate, unverifiable details while avoiding specifics that could be fact-checked. Observe whether she seems to be constructing story in real time. If pauses suggest thinking about what to say next, if details are added as she goes rather than flowing from memory, if story seems to be built during telling rather than recalled, construction process is visible. Truth-telling is recall, lying is creation, and creation takes cognitive effort, visible in delivery patterns. Notice if details serve to preempt obvious questions. If elaborate explanations address potential doubts before you raise them, if detail selection seems designed to cover logical questions you might ask, if story anticipates and answers concerns unprompted, strategic detail provision is preventing questions that might expose lies. Preemptive explanation reveals awareness that story has weak points requiring reinforcement. Why this tactic works? This tactic works because people associate detail with truth and transparency. When someone provides extensive information, we perceive them as open and honest. By exploiting this association, she creates false impression of honesty through volume rather than accuracy of information. Overwhelming detail also works because you can't possibly verify or remember everything, so contradictions and lies hide within information overload. Detail volume substitutes for truth, and most people don't realize these aren't the same thing. Psychological tactic. 6. Intermittent reinforcement. She's occasionally perfect to keep you from leaving. When she alternates between suspicious behavior that concerns you and periods of being ideal partner who's affectionate, attentive, and perfect, she's using intermittent reinforcement to keep you psychologically hooked despite red flags. This pattern of occasional perfection between problematic behavior is incredibly powerful psychological manipulation that makes leaving difficult because you remember how good it can be and hope problems were temporary, rather than recognizing pattern is itself the problem. What this tactic accomplishes. This tactic accomplishes keeping you in relationship despite mounting evidence of problems by providing just enough positive reinforcement to maintain hope. Intermittent reinforcement is most powerful form of behavioral conditioning, more powerful than consistent reinforcement. By being perfect occasionally, rather than consistently, she creates addictive pattern where you stay hoping next period of perfection is return to normal. Rather than recognizing perfection, periods are temporary manipulations between her actual problematic patterns. Notice if good periods follow your expressions of concern. If every time you're about to confront issues or considering leaving she becomes ideal partner. If perfection appears right when you're most doubtful. If timing of wonderful behavior corresponds with your wavering commitment. Behavioral improvement is strategic response to retention threat rather than genuine change. Reactive perfection reveals manipulation rather than actual relationship quality improvement. Watch whether good periods are sustained or brief. If she's perfect for few days or week, then returns to suspicious behavior. If positive changes never last long enough to represent actual transformation. If every good period is followed by return to problematic patterns, Cycling reveals manipulation rather than growth. Real change sustains. Strategic intermittent reinforcement cycles between good and bad to maintain hope without requiring actual sustained improvement. Pay attention to what happens during perfect periods. If during good periods she's also gathering information about your suspicions, if perfection includes gaining back trust that allows more freedom, if being ideal partner serves strategic purposes beyond relationship health, perfection is tactical. When good behavior accomplishes goals like restoring phone access or reducing your monitoring, improvement serves her interests, not relationship health. Observe whether perfection feels authentic or performed. If wonderful behavior seems slightly exaggerated, if affection feels staged, if her attention seems deliberately deployed rather than natural, performance quality reveals strategic behavior modification rather than genuine emotional connection. Authentic behavior has organic quality. Strategic intermittent reinforcement feels calculated because it is. Notice if you find yourself hoping for good periods to return. If you're staying in relationship because you remember how good it was during perfect periods. If you're tolerating problems, hoping she'll return to being wonderful. If those brief good times keep you from leaving, despite consistent problems, intermittent reinforcement is working exactly as designed. You're psychologically hooked on variable ratio reinforcement schedule that keeps you committed despite logical reasons to leave. Why this tactic works? This tactic works because intermittent reinforcement creates strongest psychological bonds and most resistant behavior patterns. If she were consistently terrible, you'd leave. If she were consistently wonderful, you'd be satisfied but not addicted. By alternating between wonderful and problematic, she creates an addictive pattern where you're always chasing next wonderful period while tolerating problems in between. This psychological pattern is same mechanism that makes gambling addictive, and it keeps men in relationships they know aren't healthy, because occasional perfection maintains hope that relationship can consistently be what it occasionally is.